Okay.
We're on the record.
Thank you, Madam Court Reporter. So we're back onto the record. We are on our continuation of the case that we were on this morning between Goodnight and Empire. And out in the audience and on the platform, if you could please turn off your volumes on your electronic devices and mute yourselves, we would appreciate it. We'll transfer it over to Mr. Harwood, who is our hearing examiner. So go ahead, Mr. Harwood. And here in the audience, someone has a phone or something on. We need to mute it, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Rankin, are you prepared for cross-examination of this witness at this time?
Mr. Hearing Officer, no, I'm not. And I initiated an effort to confer with Empire Counsel and other counsel. I won't be prepared today, but I will be prepared in the morning. And I'm asking that instead of having Mr. Buckwalter stand for cross, that we have, if they're available. I understand at least one of Empire's witnesses is only available today, and that's Mr. Dr. Trentham. So in order to accommodate his schedule and my ability to integrate the information I received today from Dr. Buckwalter, that we defer his examination till tomorrow morning, and that we instead take on Empire's other, hopefully 3 witnesses this afternoon, so that we can then pick up with Dr. Buckwalter in the morning. We're going to have several of our experts go back and work on integrating what we heard from today, so that I can further integrate that into my cross for tomorrow. And I think that would be, my sense is that would be the best use of my time and your time as well, because I think it would make my cross much more efficient. And I think it would save everybody time, and that would allow for any prejudice to be resolved between today and tomorrow.
Have you conferred with Ms. Hardy on this?
I initiated the doing so, but didn't complete it. So I've asked her if that would work for her, for Empire and their witnesses, and I haven't had a chance to complete that effort with her.
Ms. Hardy?
Mr. Examiner, that does not work for Empire's witnesses. Dr. Buckwalter is planning to travel home tomorrow. He's here to testify. This information was not new. It was more explanation of what Dr. Buckwalter already had in his testimony. Goodnight had a 2-hour break to review 4 slides that were just supplemental slides that were explanatory. So they already have more information now than they would have had if they would have just proceeded with the cross earlier. And so we object. We don't know whether our other witnesses are available right now. The plan was for Dr. Buckwalter to proceed this afternoon. And so that's what we are prepared to do.
I'm going to have to defer to the expertise on the commission to evaluate this, because I'm not qualified to really understand, the depth of the technical issues that were involved in the demonstrative exhibits, whether it warrants what Mr. Hardy's requesting or doesn't warrant it. So I have to turn it back. I'm not trying to pass the buck, Mr. Rosatos, but it's a technical question more than a legal one.
Mr. Rubin, you had your microphone on first, so I'll let you start with what you needed to say.
Yeah, maybe I shouldn't have. Is it feasible that Mr. Buckwalter can appear virtually tomorrow?
No, I don't think so. He's one of our primary witnesses, and I think it's important for him to be here in person and for the commission to hear from him in person.
Because it is hard for us sitting up here to sort out which one of you is correct as to how new this information is, having not heard it all and seen it all.
Well, it's not new. I think it's just additional explanation that Dr. Buckwalter would have given verbally, but now Goodnight has the benefit of having depictions of it as well. So I think they're actually better off than they would have been without the information. And so their experts can address it when they testify. But at this point, I think it is best to proceed with the cross of Dr. Buckwalter.
Before you continue, hold on. I understand. I think this is basically the concern that we were having earlier, right? That the commission was having, because we're getting this type of information, and this is what's coming over to the commission as well. And I think it is a concern for the commission also. I don't have the PhD. I know I'm not anything. I don't have a PhD. Dr. Mpoma lives and breathes this, and he has the concern as well. We heard from you, Ms. Hardy. Thank you. Mr. Rankin, we heard from you to give me, and I know you have more to say. I saw your microphone go on. Mr. Moander, you were ready to say something?
So I'm going to renew my suggestion that I think it would clarify the land.
Wait up, Mr. Moander. If we can make sure that you keep yourselves muted on the platform, please. It's becoming a problem. So please keep yourselves muted. Thank you, Mr. Moander. Go ahead.
OCD would renew its suggestion that an offer of proof of disclosure of the materials should resolve some of this in order to clarify what was disclosed and what wasn't, which would lend credence to potentially either side as to their positions. I did take a look. I did not do a detailed look. I'm not seeing it. I could certainly be wrong, but an offer of proof from Empire that this material in some way, shape, or form was disclosed should, like I said, resolve this. So that's a renewed suggestion.
Okay. I'm going to go through everybody and then I'll come back to you, Mr. Rankin. Mr. Beck.
Well, I think significant number of people in the room do not have the technical expertise to speak to the new material. I think no one disputes that there are at least 4 new slides that were disclosed and that Mr. Buckwalter testified about. Mr. Rankin is leaps and bounds smarter than I am in this material. And, as an advocate, representing his client, has said that it's unfair and it prejudices him, prejudices his client. It's not the first time we've seen new material coming in late. I hope it will be the last. I don't know if that's too optimistic. I think that asking for a few hours to digest the material tonight and come back tomorrow is incredible. It's certainly an olive branch that I don't think necessarily he should extend, but that he's done so. I certainly think that request is infinitely reasonable. And I think everyone agrees that it's certainly looking to me like Empire will not even finish with all of its witnesses by tomorrow afternoon. And so I don't think that putting Mr. Buckwalter back in the mix to appear some other time, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's later when we reconvene, is going to upset the pace that we're at right now.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Parrott.
Hi, Commissioners.
I apologize, Mr. Suazo. You're back. My apologies.
No problem. I had OCD hearings this morning, so I'm back and was able to tune in for the last couple of hours. And I've sent Ms. Hardy's PowerPoint to Pilot, but obviously everybody's busy. And I have not heard back from their technical folks. So we also would like some additional time to review. And I concur with Mr. Beck that, this is going to go on for some time. And I think we just need to make sure that everybody has the chance to really examine all the information that the commission is considering and also have a fair chance to ask the questions that we would like to have answered as a result of that information. So I support Mr. Beck and Mr. Rankin's position.
Okay. I hear you. I see you. Thank you, Mr. Suazo. I see you, Mr. Hearing Officer. Before you continue, I have 2 questions, but I want to see what you have to say first, and then we go from there.
Okay, maybe we're reading each other's minds. I guess what I would like to hear is from Dr. Buckwalter himself, whether or not you could change your travel plans and be here tomorrow.
I'd rather not, but if I have to, I have to.
So that was kind of along the lines, and I apologize, Ms. Hardy. I was kind of conferring with Dr. Mpoma as you were answering about the doctor being on the platform tomorrow instead of potentially being here. And I didn't hear what the answer was. I apologize.
I said that I don't think that it's our preference to have him here in person because I think his testimony is really critical. And he's supposed to be traveling tomorrow. So
Okay.
being on the platform tomorrow doesn't solve.
Okay.
that
That was the
Yeah,
answer
thank you.
that I missed. I apologize. Give me 1 second. Okay, thank you. Mr. Rankin, my question to you. The commission did not, which slides are the 4 extra slides? My apologies, because the commission didn't see certain slides either, right? Empire skipped through those. I realize that this is information that you are working on and that Goodnight is definitely concerned. Please explain to us as well the slides that we didn't see. How is it pertinent? I apologize. As I said, I'm a layperson, so I'm trying to figure it out myself. And you're muted. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, let me just get on the line. Part of the problem, Chair, is I'm not going to be able to fully articulate this because I'm still integrating it. Okay. I did have, I mean, however long it was a fire hose. Okay. And so the reason I'm telling you that I can't go forward is because I'm not in a position to articulate, to explain to you how to integrate what I learned today and what I knew before. My point is that we have 6 pages of double-spaced testimony that explains all, 18, 19, 20 exhibits that are his final model and all the different things he did in his final model. The 6 pages of written testimony is woefully insufficient to even explain what he has here. The problem I have is that, what I had laid out was to explore what was missing in his testimony in these slides. Okay. Now I'm hearing things over an hour of summary that was new, not in the written testimony and couldn't easily be discernible from the slides. I think perhaps maybe some of our experts could intuit some of that, perhaps based on the slides and because they're intimately familiar with the data. But I have not myself integrated that. That's my problem. I'm the one who's charged with cross-examining him. And I am not in a position to integrate what I learned this morning with what was in the slides today and what little bit was in this 6-page rebuttal testimony.
And I understand the frustration. I apologize. I'm not trying to come across to anybody, and I'm not necessarily pointing a finger. We have to understand as well. And so you laugh at me all the time. At this point, go ahead, Mr. Hearing Examiner.
I'm just thinking if Dr. Buckwalter can be here tomorrow and if you can be prepared tomorrow, that seems like a reasonable solution that would appear to accommodate Ms. Hardy's interest in having Dr. Buckwalter here in person and would give you the time you need, Mr. Rankin, to complete your preparation for cross. Just don't come tomorrow and say, I need more time.
So before you even answer that, Mr. Rankin, here's my thing. This commission has heard individuals off of the platform before. I realize that it's the best to have someone in person, but we also have to take into account that people travel and people come from out of state. And Ms. Hardy, I leave this question is to you and to your team, and for the doctor as well. But you're the lawyer we're talking to. Could we not just continue this witness for another time? He could be on the platform. Mr. Rankin will be able to gather all of the information questions that he has. And we don't have to necessarily have the doctor here in person. We could have him on the platform. Of course, you all have to agree to this. This is just a suggestion that I have. And we allow, I think it would allow Goodnight the opportunity to be able to get the information that they need, to get their experts time to be able to review the differences that are between the written and the PowerPoint. But it also gives your witness the opportunity to be able to explain what he has to say, but just not in person.
Mr. Chair, I think I would need to consult with my client, but I think that we would rather proceed with Dr. Buckwalter tomorrow if he can change his travel plans.
That would be perfect with us. But I'm just trying to offer options.
Yes,
Because
I understand.
we both sides both have pertinent points, but we're trying to accommodate as well. So 15 more minutes.
Probably 15 would do it. If we're going to proceed this way, then we need to make sure our other witnesses are available.
Sure.
Because we had not planned on that.
Okay. Let's reconvene at 2:05. That gives us the 15 minutes, and then we can discuss again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, it's 2:05. We're back on the record. Madam Court Reporter, are we on the record?
We're on the record.
Thank you. Ms. Hardy, we'll start off with you. We posed a couple of options. So could you let us know what the decision was?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We are prepared to proceed with Dr. Trentham as our witness next.
Okay, and our other doctor will be here tomorrow?
Dr. Buckwalter will be here tomorrow.
Okay,
And after Dr. Trentham, we can proceed with Mr. Melzer and Mr. McShane if we get that far.
okay. I love your optimism. That's great. Mr. Hearing Officer, we transfer it back to you.
Oh, okay, great. So it's Robert Trentham? Trentham?
Yes, that's correct. And Mr. Padilla is presenting Dr. Trentham.
Okay.
And the doctor's on the platform, correct?
He should
Here I am.
be.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll get him to be on the Zoom. Thank you.
Okay, great. Doctor, if you'll please raise your right hand. You swear and affirm the testimony you give here today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury.
I do so swear.
All right, thank you, sir. Mr. Padilla.
Dr. Trentham, please state your name for the record.
It's Robert Craig Trentham.
I'm sorry, I think I called you Dr. Trentham. And
Oh, that's okay.
give the commission, Dr. Trentham, a little bit about your educational background.
Okay, I have a bachelor's and master's in geology from the City College of New York and a doctor of geological sciences from the University of Texas in El Paso.
What have you done in terms of preparation for this hearing and the self-affirmed statement that you signed?
Well, obviously, I've written the statement. I've reviewed many of the materials provided to me by Empire. I've had discussions with Steve Melzer and with Bob Lindsay, both of whom I've known for decades and have worked with also for decades.
Give the commission an overview of, briefly, of what you prepared.
Okay, my expertise, I guess, to bring to the table on this project is an understanding of residual oil zones. And I've been, like many geologists, I've worked in exploration and production for over 20 years before I came to the university. It's always been frustrating that there are these zones that have oil shows, calculated as potentially productive, and yet they turn out to be dry holes because they make mostly oil water. And in the last 20 years or so, along with Bob Lindsay and Steve Melzer and others, we've been coming to realize that there are these intervals that have residual oil, but are not productive in the classical sense of primary or water flood production. And so
let me stop you there, Dr. Trentham.
Okay.
Your resume or curriculum states all of the qualifications that you have, especially with respect to ROZ developments in the Permian Basin, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay. We tender Dr. Trentham as an expert with regards to ROZ in the or testimony in this case.
Any objection from Goodnight?
No objection.
OCD?
No objection.
No objection.
And that was Rice. And from Pilot?
No objection from Pilot.
Dr. Trentham will be so recognized.
Dr. Trentham, you prepared a self-affirmed statement regarding a little bit of what you said with regard to your expertise in ROZ developments and geology. You have prepared what are exhibits D1 through D22. Well, attached to your self-affirmed statement are exhibits D1 through D22, correct?
Yes,
And you also have 6 tables. They're labeled D1 through D6, correct?
yes. Mhm.
Dr. Trentham, to your knowledge, are the contents of your self-affirmed statement and the exhibits attached to that and the tables that are attached to your exhibits true and correct to the best of your knowledge?
That's correct, sir.
Mr. Chairman, we tender or Dr. Trentham's self-affirmed statement and the exhibits attached to it, specifically D1 through D22 and tables D1 through D6 into evidence.
Any objection? Goodnight.
No objection.
OCD.
No objection.
Rice.
No objection.
Highlands.
No objections.
They'll be admitted.
Dr. Trentham, we've prepared a few slides for you to summarize your testimony as shown by the self-affirmed statement that has been introduced into evidence. Let me try to share those slides. And then
Before
we'll-
we go there, these have been shared with, we're not going down the same rabbit hole we were this morning, are we? These have been shared with Goodnight.
Yes, I have.
Okay.
They've had them for quite a while, matter of fact.
Assuming that they're just right out of his exhibits, that's fine. But if it's something different, then I haven't seen slides for today, but if they're right out of his exhibits, that's fine. He hasn't shared what slides he's going to present, so I don't know.
I'm just trying to avoid another train wreck. It's all right.
I don't think I'm going to have a train wreck for you, Mr. Harwood. Let's see. Please bear with me.
Are we having issues sharing?
We
Yes.
are, but I think Mr. Padilla can email me the slides and I can share them. Because it seems that he's having a problem with the sharing.
Sure. I'm going to just make the suggestion, Ms. Hardy, they should send you all the slides.
Thank you. Yes.
So then we don't have the big gap. So
Understood.
from here on out, send all the slides to Ms. Hardy so she can have them ready, please.
We will do that.
Thanks. And doctor, thank you for your patience. We apologize.
No problem. He's probably better at it than I am.
Dr. Trentham, finally got help on this thing, and I'm glad for that. Let's look at the first slide, which is Exhibit D2, and that comes from your testimony before, correct?
That's correct. I used the same exhibit numbers are on the original documents.
Okay, tell us what's contained in this slide.
Okay, this is a slide that shows or places the M sub, EMSU, and the AGU fields along the Artesia trend, which is one of a number of trends that we have identified as having had this meteoric-derived flushing, where the original oil columns were much thicker than they are today, and the lower portions of the oil columns have been essentially swept by what we refer to as Mother Nature's water flood. This particular base map here is from Alton Brown, who was working independently on trying to figure out ROZs when he was at ARCO in the late 90s. And what he was doing is he took this data from unitization agreements and other information and noticed a tilted oil water contact on the base in these fields, and that each one had a different flow direction. And so he was the first one to kind of point out that even today, there's still this flow that is moving through these trends and beneath these fields.
You have some dark arrows there in black. What do those represent?
Those are the arrows. That's the direction, and the number associated with the arrow is the amount of tilt in feet per mile on the base of the oil water contact in those fields. And this is directly from Alton Brown's presentation that he made. He made a couple, one in 1999, another one in 2001.
Now, you've also identified the Wasson Field there with the red arrow.
Correct.
Why did you do that?
Because it's probably the largest of the fields where we have documentation over probably 15 miles of these tilted oil water contacts from the Wasson Field and on up along the trend along the eastern edge of the Northwest Shelf. And then the other fields, of course, there's places where he's documented. And you can see by the direction of the arrows that there obviously are more than one trend that or direction of flow, and each one of those is associated with a different trend.
In terms of the Artesia trend, what else do you find in there that is significant?
The Artesia trend, part of it extends across the southern edge of the Northwest Shelf, and so there's data from vacuum field, and we also have ROZ information down to the south in Texas beyond the limit of this map.
Okay. Do you have anything else on this slide?
No.
Okay. Dr. Trentham, we've seen this with Dr. Lindsay, this next slide.
Yes.
Give us your version of how this slide is appropriate or pertinent to this hearing.
Okay, well, the lower cross-section is a representation of the cross-section that hangs in most geologists' office in the Permian Basin. It's the east-west cross-section of the basin that was done in the 1950s by the people who preceded us. Then what Bob Lindsay did was he kind of reconstructed what it had to have looked like before the late stage tectonics, which have cut off the hydraulic head to the west. He reestablished that it would be easy to have this hydraulic head flushing from as far west as the San Andres Mountains between Alamogordo and Las Cruces. And that these waters would be flushing down through the San Andres, especially, but other intervals as well. And so that we have enough horsepower or hydraulic head for this flushing to occur, and this flushing then is responsible for removing the movable oil from the residual oil zone intervals. And you can see the direction of flow that he's indicating with his arrows in there.
Okay, if you look at the top of the top depiction, we see the Central Basin platform. Does that correspond to the bottom depiction of the
Yes,
Rio
yes, it
Grande
does.
River? Okay.
Yes, it does.
And where would you find ROZ in the Central Basin Platform?
Well, we find them on both the east side and the west side of the Central Basin Platform, extending from, say, Hobbs on the northwest side, all the way down to north of Fort Stockton. On the east side of the platform, we see them from the Seminole Field, north of Seminole, all the way down to Upton County and Crockett County on the south, and the McCamey Field.
Is ROZ generally found in a conventional oil development?
Well, let's see. Yes, that's true. We find them under many existing fields, and a little further on in my testimony, I'll talk about the different kinds of ROZs. But yes, we find them associated with Grayburg, St. Andreas, Clear Fork, Tubb, or Drinkard fields on the Northwest Shelf, on the Central Basin Platform, and also in a couple of places on the Eastern Shelf.
Is that generally where you've had primary production in an upper zone?
Yes. Mhm. The one example, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is the tall cotton field where there is no main pay.
Okay. Can we move on to the next slide?
Okay,
Yeah.
so this is a slide that Steve Melzer put together, actually, probably 15 years ago now. And this is after many, days, hours, months of discussion about these different trends. And so this shows where we see the different trends across the basin. And you can see they extend as far west at this point as the Guadalupe and the Sacramento Mountains. And they extend across the basin. So the trend on the north is the slaughter levelland trend, which extends then across the northern part of the Midland Basin over to the Eastern Shelf. The lower trend of the kind of the darker color, that's the Artesia trend, which then comes down the west side of the platform, and then down across and out towards the Ozona platform. Then the kind of the fatter arrows include the trend where the Wasson Field is located, and then the other set of yellow arrows on the east side of the platform indicates where we see the flow paths on the east side of the platform. We also have a couple of other flow paths. There's a Roswell trend, it's kind of the smaller arrows in there where there's just a limited amount of production and just smaller ROZs. And then there's another one across the Midland Basin where we know there are thick intervals that have residual oil type values in the San Andreas, but the San Andreas is not productive there, but it just hasn't been explored as yet. As I've said to Steve many times, we just can't do everything.
Dr. Trenham, is it fair to say that you're going to find ROZ throughout this pathways?
Yes, not continually, but certainly, yes. Along those pathways, you'll find fields with brownfield ROZs beneath them. And you'll see areas where there are ROZs without an associated existing productive field.
Let's move on to the next slide.
Okay.
What does this Exhibit D4 show?
Okay, this is the three types of different ROZs, and this was again put together by Steve Melzer. The first one would be where you have the oil migrate into the traps, and then at a later date, you tilt the basin and allow the oil to migrate out past the spill points of the different traps. That's a type 1. That's not common in the Permian Basin. The type 2, that's where the oil is migrated into a trap, and we've seen a failure of the seal, and oil is migrated out past the trap, and we have that as a type 2 type ROZ. There are a limited number of fields in the Permian Basin where type 2 is present. type 3 is the one that's associated with our Mother Nature's water flood. In this case, what happens is that the area to the west has been tilted up, and as a result of the uplift to the west, we see these meteoric-derived flushing fluids coming down from the area, the watershed, essentially, from as far west as the Rio Grande, across the San Andres Mountains and across the Sacramentos and the Guadalupes and into the basin, and flushing out the lower portion of the ROZs, the lower portion of the original oil column, and creating an ROZ.
Dr. Trenham, is type 3 the type of ROS that you would find underlying the MSU and the AGU and the MSUB?
Yes, it is.
And that would be in the San Andres Formation.
That is correct.
Okay. Let's go on.
This is just a little zeroing in on this to better understand the relationships between the ROZs and where they're found. So in the upper one, there, the lower portion of the oil column has been flushed by Mother Nature's water flood beneath an existing field, excuse me, and the field itself, it retains the oil, and you do not see it flushed out completely as you see in the flushed out, movable oil flushed out completely as you do see in the ROZs. So where we have ROZs beneath an existing field, we call those brownfields. And in areas where, for one reason or another, either a lack of trap or more hydraulic head, the entire column of oil has been flushed, except for some little areas where there's lower permeability and porosity, where higher oil saturation is retained, where all of the column has been removed. And the example of that is the tall cotton field in Gaines County. And that's a green field.
In the lower depiction, the dynamic system, as you've labeled it, do you see, when you drill through it, any oil?
Yes, and this has been the conundrum that we've, as exploration production geologists, have had for decades, that you do see the types of shows. You see drilling breaks, you see maybe oil in the pits, you see gas and oil in samples. You might even see a calculation on the logs of productive well saturations. And so, yes, you can see all of those. However, when you attempt to complete those wells, they are they're doomed to failure, because you're looking at residual. Basically, the residual in those fields, those green fields, is similar to the residual to a water flood you see in a well-established and well-run water flood. So your oil is at this point not movable except through use of CO2 EOR.
So you need a CO2 flood in order to get the oil out.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, here we have a slide about Exhibit D6, and this is a tall cotton slide that you
That's
talked
correct.
about earlier. Tell us about the tall cotton.
Okay, tall cotton is in kind of west central Gaines County. To the east is the Seminole Field and the town of Seminole. Between Seminole and tall cotton is the West Seminole Field. And tall cotton was actually keyed off of two wells that had been previously drilled in the area. The one being the Anschutz Keating well to the northwest. That was actually a well that was drilled looking at a Clear Fork anomaly on seismic. They cored that well. They had good mud logs. And the mud logs and the electric logs and all the information they had, as the geologist who had that well told me, he said, oh, it's a no-brainer. They set casing. They completed in the interval where there was all saturation on the core and then the mud logs. And over about 3 months time frame, they made 8 barrels of oil and 3,600 barrels of water and eventually plugged the well. That is kind of what we believe to be a typical response of an ROZ to an attempted completion. So that's an area. So in this area, we know there's ROZ potential. The Reed and Stevens Charlene well actually made a few thousand barrels of oil, but it was not an economic discovery. And it was also eventually plugged. At a later date, Kinder Morgan came in, and with the information they had on the Reed and Stevens, they borrowed actually, I had the core from the Anschutz Keating. They borrowed the core from me, and they had the mud logs. And so they evaluated this area and determined it was a good place to initiate a greenfield ROZ flood. In 2014, they initiated a CO2 flood. It took about 6 months, but they eventually started to make oil, and they got up to 2,000 barrels a day or more in production with ROZ only.
So would you say that the Tall Cotton was a successful play?
Oh, it's an excellently successful site, yes.
And there had been no primary production or water flood in that field?
There had been minor production from the Reed and Stevens Charlene well, but that's it.
Okay. Let's move on to the next slide. What's shown on this Exhibit D9?
Okay, this is information from a presentation made by Hess on the Seminole Field. This is the Seminole Field. The city of Seminole is right at the very southeastern end of the field. And in the 1980s, they were drilling deeper because they also had Clear Fork production. And they noticed that there was all shows in the interval below the main pay in the St. Andrews. And so management with foresight determined that they needed to get more information about this interval. They started to take modern suites of logs through the interval, and they took cores, and the cores they took range from conventional cores to sponge cores to pressure cores. And what they determined was that there was a range of saturations that they saw between the conventional cores and the sponge cores and the pressure cores, and that these saturations, assuming that the better estimations of the actual oil in place and the saturations were from the pressure cores, that these were indicating that this was a potential target for CO2 enhanced oil recovery. Then in the late middle 1990s, they actually started their first what they called the ROZ phase 1, which was they mixed injecting CO2 into the main pay, which was already under CO2 flood, and the ROZ, and they saw a response. And then they decided that they weren't quite sure how much was coming from the ROZ, so they did ROZ phase 2, and in there they did an ROZ only CO2 flood, and then they demonstrated to their confidence that ROZ was floodable in this area, and they have since gone in through a series of stages to complete ROZ through production throughout the field.
Okay, on the right side of this Exhibit D9, what is that?
That was a pattern where you'd see where the producers and the injectors were located for the ROZ flood in phase 2.
Oh, this was a brownfield development, right?
That's correct. This is a brownfield development. Mm-hmm.
How far away is the Seminole Field from Hemsu? More or less.
Probably about 45 miles, but it's on the other side of the Central Basin platform. So essentially you have the same reservoirs are present on both sides of the platform.
Okay. You have anything else on, well, okay. On D, let's move on to D10.
Okay. All right, this is a chart that was put together by Steve Melzer. And so the upper numbers or the upper curves are actually the number of wells. So just kind of ignore those, other than to see that they did an infill drilling project in the mid 1980s, like a lot of other companies. But what they were seeing was that they were seeing a decrease in the production. We were on the decline curve. So the kind of decline curve that you would normally expect, that's that kind of light blue line there.
Okay.
Okay. Then though, they had started, as I mentioned before, they had started a CO2 flood in the main pay in the mid 1980s. So the red curve, as you can see, rapidly increasing, in production. That's the response of the main pay CO2 flood. And then in 1996, with the first introduction of the ROZ flood, then you see that there's that uptick in production off that other curve, kind of a little bit darker blue curve over there. And then you can see where phase one was, where phase two was, and then where they started to do the more infilling to the remainder of the field. You can see that it's a mix of the production from the main pay main pay CO2 flood, and then you can see how the line extending to the right is the additional production they have gotten from the residual oil zone.
What's the graph at the top, the very top one? And
That's just the producing well count.
okay. So what conclusion do you draw from this graph?
The conclusion that you draw from this graph is not only is the CO2 enhanced oil recovery project in the main pay successful, but the CO2 enhanced oil recovery project in the ROZ is also successful.
Okay. Now we have table D1. What do you show here?
Okay, what I did was just put together as an example of how thick ROZs can be, the relationship of field main pay thicknesses and ROZ thicknesses that I am confident in. And that would be the Platang, the Seminole Vacuum, Wasson, GLSAU, Goldsmith, Landris, St. Andrews Unit, Seminole East, and McCamey. And you can see that the ROZ thickness will vary. Now, it's not a uniform thickness, but Platang, Tall Cotton, neither one of those have an associated main pay. So their entire floodable interval is the ROZ. At M-sub, the reason I've said 0 is that in the St. Andrews, there is no main pay, or just a few wells that made a few barrels. So the M-sub San Andreas ROZ thickness is potentially as thick as 370 feet. And that's based off the work that Bob Lindsay did in the mid-1990s when he worked for Chevron and was working this area, where he identified stain in the St. Andreas as deep as 370 feet below the top of St. Andreas. And those are in documents that I know he's already submitted.
That would be in the upper St. Andrews, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And the Tall Cotton is on the third line here, or second line, I should say. That's 400 feet of pay.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is let me modify that just slightly. That's the deepest oil saturation that they saw in the cores. And I've seen the cores for Tall Cotton, so I'm familiar with that.
In terms of MSU at the very top, what kind of oil saturation would you expect to see there?
I've seen two of the cores, the 679 and the number 4 Bell. And in there, I've seen the cores start up in the Grayburg, but they have the upper St. Andreas, the interval above the Lovington Sand, and they TD, one of them anyway, TDs below the Lovington sand, and there is all saturation identified in core throughout that interval. So, I have confidence in at least that much of it. We haven't seen core beneath that, so we're hoping to get that at some point.
So, and going back to the MSU, where you show zero main pay, you're talking only about the San Andres,
That's
correct?
correct. Mhm.
Now, if you were to develop Ross in the lower Grayburg, what kind of thickness would you expect?
Well, that is a
If-
question that I can't answer. I'm aware from my discussions with Bob Lindsay that there is a flanking or edge ROZ to the west side of the EMSU, kind of down off the structure to the west, where there is an ROZ in the Grayburg. There is no ROZ in the Grayburg across the top of the structure, as is my understanding. There is actually one field, it's the George Allen Field, which is in northwestern Gaines County on the Northwest Shelf, where a company has gone in and in using CO2 EOR on the flank of this structure, not immediately beneath the main pay, but just off the flank, similar to what we believe is going on here at EMSU.
Okay. Is it fair to say that you would find a Ross above the San Andres and a Ross below the top of the San Andres?
Objection, Mr. Hearing Officer. Mr. Trentham, Dr. Trentham did not offer rebuttal testimony. Mr. Padilla is eliciting rebuttal testimony in the summary of Dr. Trentham's direct testimony.
I'm not sure I understand the objection, frankly. It's technical. It's over
Yeah.
my head. I
Well,
have to be honest.
Mr. Hearing Officer, we had a pre-hearing order in which we were following the disclosure of witnesses. Dr. Trentham was disclosed as a witness for direct testimony. He was not included as a rebuttal witness. Mr. Padilla is now eliciting testimony that goes beyond the scope of his direct testimony. It is rebuttal. Okay, he's introducing a new concept that Dr. Trentham did not address in his direct testimony about about whether the EMSU has more than one RZ in it. That was not addressed in his direct testimony.
Okay, Mr. Padilla.
We've gone through this table D1. What's shown there is that you have brownfield and greenfield Ross developments. The MSU and the San Andres has zero main pay. All the others after the third line have pay, probably in the Grayburg. I haven't asked that question, and I'm just simply asking, it's not rebuttal. I'm just simply asking if you would expect to have or could find Ross above the San Andres and below the San Andres.
Well, that sounds like an opinion you're seeking from this witness. Is that an opinion that was disclosed as part of his testimony?
Well, it's inherent in all of the discussion between the Grayburg and the San Andres. I don't know. Everything, there's been ample discovery in this case above and below the San Andres. This morning, for example, Dr. Buchwald talked about this Grayburg and the San Andres and how water penetrated above and through from the San Andres to the Grayburg. I mean, it's inherent in all of the discussion. Well, I'm not asking for a rebuttal And I don't know what I would be rebutting.
Okay, Mr. Hearing Officer, what's happening here is that Empire's shifting its position. They recognize that there's a potential issue about a composite sequence boundary that divides the San Andreas from the Grayburg. Dr. Trentham has not addressed this issue. He simply, in his testimony, simply took from all of his papers and presentations and put a summary together, giving an overview of the not even the EMSU, but of the Permian Basin and his experience and understanding of ROZs and how they came about. He has not reviewed any, other than the two cores, okay, he has not reviewed any data or information related to the EMSU. He did not address in his direct testimony, and that's all he submitted. That's all he was disclosed to submit was on his direct testimony. Mr. Padilla is now eliciting, based on the evidence that was presented here now today, additional testimony that is not part of his direct testimony. The purpose of these summaries is
other Empire witnesses have covered this territory.
absolutely.
All
So
right,
at the
then
very
I'm
least,
going to sustain the objection. I'll find it's cumulative.
Mr. Harwood, I don't know where I go. You sustain the objection that I can inquire into whether or not there's a Ross in the Grayburg? Is that?
Stick to what has been disclosed to Goodnight in terms of what this witness is expected to testify to.
Okay, we'll move on. That's the end of the show. So we pass Dr. Trentham per cross.
Dr. Trentham, how are you today?
I'm good, sir. Is this Adam? I can't tell.
Yeah, this is me, Adam. Sorry that you're not here in person. I would love to have got to meet you. Someday I hope that we cross paths in New York and we can have a dark at McSorley's old ale house, but another day.
Yeah, I go back to McSorley's before women were allowed in. So
Yeah. I guess it's a little different, although not too much. I think, Dr. Trentham, what did Empire retain you to testify about in this case?
residual oil zones and the potential for the presence at MSUB and EMSU and AGU.
And more broadly than that, didn't they ask you to give a general overview of ROZs in the Permian Basin?
Yes, they did.
Okay. But you've not been asked to evaluate whether the purported ROZ in the San Andreas at the EMSU is recoverable?
No, they asked me if I believe there was a potential for an ROZ there, which there is.
And you haven't been asked to opine on whether or what the recovery factors might be,
No, I have not.
or whether the purported ROZ in the San Andreas is economically recoverable?
I've not made an evaluation of that, although I firmly believe it is.
Okay. But that wasn't, you weren't asked to provide that opinion, were you?
No,
And you haven't been provided any data or documents or evidence that would allow you to make an opinion or conclusion on that in this case, have you?
on what?
On whether the ROZ, potential ROZ in the San Andreas is economically recoverable?
From what I have seen, I believe it is, but
Let me ask this question again. Have you been provided any documents, any economic information or evidence from Empire on what the cost would be to develop this proposed project?
no economics.
You're not offering any opinions about petrophysics?
I have opinions, but they haven't been asked for them.
Okay, and they weren't included in your direct testimony, were they?
Well, that's what I mean.
Okay. And you did not review any of the underlying unitization documents the evidence, exhibits, or testimony that were submitted to the commission here in New Mexico at the time the EMSU was formed. Did you?
I've seen the unitization agreement, and that's all.
Okay. And you haven't reviewed the transcript that was prepared, or the transcript of the hearing resulting from that statutory hearing on the EMSU, have you?
No.
And at the time you prepared your direct testimony, you didn't review any of the well files or production data separate from any of the witnesses' testimony or exhibits that you reviewed in this case?
I've looked at the core and the logs. But other than that, I just have secondhand information from Bob Lindsay.
Okay. And during the course of this hearing this week, have you observed or listened to any of the expert testimony in this case?
Lindsay's.
Okay, but you didn't participate in or listen to any of the other experts who gave testimony or opinions in this hearing this week?
That's correct.
And I think I understood you to say this, but the information that you depict in table D1, I'll see if I can pull it up real quick. The information that you depict in table D1 is entirely based on information you obtained from Dr. Lindsay?
The only information on that table that I've gotten from Dr. Lindsay is about the EMSU. All the other is my information.
Got it. Thanks for the clarification. At the time you prepared your direct testimony, you were not aware of any ROZs thicker than the intervals you provide on table D1, correct?
That's correct. These are the ones I'm confident of. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Well, let me ask again. I mean, are you aware of any ROZs out there that have been documented to have thicker intervals than what you presented on this table?
I don't have any information to tell me that there's any ones that are thicker. I have anecdotal information that tells me there may be two, but that's nothing I could testify to.
And at the time you prepared your direct testimony, you were unaware of the volumes of water that were produced from the 6 EMSU salt water supply wells, correct?
I had kind of peripheral knowledge about them.
But you weren't aware of what the volumes were, correct?
That's correct.
And you did not investigate prior to preparing your direct testimony what zone in the San Andres those water supply wells were producing from?
I was just told that they were deeper in the San Andres than the ROZ.
Okay. And you were also not aware of the approximately 20 additional water supply wells that have withdrawn water from the San Andres in the area, offsetting the EMSU?
No, I'm not.
At the time of your direct testimony in this case, were you were also unaware that there was produced water disposal occurring in the San Andres within the exterior boundaries of the EMSU since the 1960s?
Again, only just anecdotal information.
Okay. And at the time of your direct testimony, you were unaware that Empire was also disposing of produced water into the same San Andres disposal zone within the EMSU. Is that correct?
That's correct.
No further questions.
Microphone, Mr. Harwood.
Sorry, thank you. Mr. Molander,
Yes, sir.
you have cross-examination?
Briefly, Mr. Hearing Officer,
All right,
may I proceed?
please proceed.
Good afternoon again. It's nice to see you, and I'll wave so you can see where I'm at there. Doctor, appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
Just a few questions. I wanted to confirm you didn't submit any rebuttal testimony for the cases before the commission, correct?
Correct.
Now, let's step back in time briefly. Do you recall being deposed on November 5th, 2024 in these matters?
Yes.
And do you recall when I inquired of you whether you had an opinion on the migration of injection fluids from the EMSU San Andres Formation to the Hobbs Channel and the Capitan Reef? What you stated was you didn't have, and I quote, "No, at this point, I would make, I have no, nothing, I would say no." Do you recall that statement?
Yes, I remember.
And would it be fair to say that what you were trying to say in the deposition is that you didn't have an opinion to provide at that point on the query posed to you?
Yeah, the way my mind works is I had to create a three-dimensional picture in my head and so I kind of stuttered through that. That's why I was hesitant.
I've known several folks like that, Doctor. I appreciate it. Later on in that deposition, you then opined when an inquiry was made by Goodnight Counsel Rankin that the EMSU San Andres hydrologically was separate from the Capitan Reef. Do you have any reason to dispute that statement?
Capitan and the San Andres are not in communication. That's true.
And then do you recall that you were asked, well, I inquired about the authorities upon which you relied for that. Do you recall testifying it was that your opinion was based on observation and discussion?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I'll pass the witness.
Okay, Mr. Beck, questions for Dr. Trenton?
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Suazo,
No questions from pilot.
commission.
I don't have any questions, commissioners.
Bob,
Yes,
this is
sir.
William.
Hey, William, how you doing?
I'm good. Nice meeting you. I do have just some few questions for you.
Sure.
So I'm looking at your direct statement, and on page 3 of that, the last but one paragraph, you talk about the results of the above studies and others shows the identification of the raws is not necessarily difficult or expensive. Can you quantify what you mean by expensive? Not expensive?
Well, first of all, my opinion is if you don't develop the ROZ, that's real expensive. A lot of our early work, especially of trying to determine what exactly an ROZ looked like, was done off mud logs, core reports, anecdotal information from people that came up and said, "Oh yeah, I had one of those, and here it is." So developing the potential for an ROZ in any area can be relatively inexpensive because it's data mining. Then, of course, what I would recommend always, and I recommend it to Empire as well as anybody else, would be full suites of logs, whole core, good quality mud logging, the basic tools that you would use to evaluate the potential for any prospect. DSTs don't work in ROZs because of their very nature, because of the saturations. They're so low. DSTs usually recover all water. One of the things historically about DSTs has been that because of the water flooding by Mother Nature, this meteoric derived water, which brings in oxygen, the water chemistry in an ROZ is almost everywhere I've seen it and have data for it, different than the water chemistry in the main pay. And so if you have DST information, I did a large study on the west side of the platform centered around the Monahans area from Kermit down to the south. DSTs, historically, almost every single one of them that encountered a DST recovered sulfur water. And in the cores, we also see native sulfur. And so the evidence like that, it's cumulative evidence. We see sulfur in the cores, we see sulfur water on DSTs, we see mudlog shows, we see calculations of well saturations that if you're not using the right AMs and Ns and RWs, you're going to be wrong. You know, all those things together, they're relatively inexpensive relative to a failure.
Bob, so you made mention of a recommendation and you described that to the commission. Now, my question to you is that based on your discussions with Empire, do you believe they've done enough analysis to solidify the argument about the existence of, let's say, potential recoverable ROZ in the San Andres?
From what I've seen, and this is basically off the two cores, the 679 and the number 4. From what I've seen in those wells and in some of the logs that I've seen that looked at with Dr. Lindsay and my understanding of what it takes to have an ROZ, I believe that their money is well spent doing a further evaluation. We don't know where the base of the ROZ is at this point. The one core that penetrated below the Lovington sand had oil saturations to the very bottom of the core. So I don't know if they've seen the bottom of the ROZ. It could extend all the way down to the base of the G8 for all I know, another 200 feet. I just don't know. More work needs to be done in the form of gathering more data, core analyses, and good logs, maybe even FMIs, those kind of things. But yes, there is an ROZ there. Now we have to quantify how good it is, how thick it is.
You know, I do like the FMI. Can you confirm to the commission that certainly the FMI will also help us to know if there are any existing fractures?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And the other reason I like an FMI is that you match it to the core, and then in other wells, if you want to save a little bit of money, take 2 or 3 cores, and then as you further develop, you do more FMIs. But have FMIs in the wells where you've got core, match your FMI to the core, and then go forward with FMIs.
Thank you. Bob, still back to your direct testimony on page 3, the last paragraph. On line 2, you said the water flooded swept intervals still have 20 to 40% residual oil in the pore space. Bob, this one, are you referring to the flooded area, or it also applies to the exterior area of the flooded area?
Exterior. I would restrict that to the water flood area. I'm not sure what would be outside the water flood area.
So, Bob, do you have an example of where we have an effective water flood where the residual oil saturation goes to like 40%?
All right. The Platang field. That's up in Yoakum County. It's northwest of Wasson and west of just east of the Texas-New Mexico state line. That area, there are higher oil saturations at the top of the San Andres Pay. And the top of the San Andres Pay is actually in the lower San Andres, beneath the Brushy Canyon bypass surface or the pie marker. Okay, so in the upper portion there, you have what I refer to as shingles of thin, mostly tidal flat or subtidal rocks that have higher oil saturations. And you can call them heavy ROZs if you want. They're not going to produce oil by themselves of any large amount, but they have higher oil saturations than 40%. And that's in the kind of greenfield area like where Platang is located.
Bob, so on that same page, you talk about on average an additional recovery of 10 to 20% of the oil of the original oil in place in a field is possible using CO2. Can you tell the commission if you have any reference for this?
This is based on the types of recoveries you get in a main pay ROZ, the relative to the water floods and the excuse me, the water flood and the primary production in the main pays. It's just a kind of I guess, a shorthand that people like Steve Melzer and Bob Lindsay and I use. We know that in main pays, you can get that kind of recovery factor in a St. Andrews field. And there is no reason to believe that with similar oil saturations in the ROZ to residual to an effective water flood, that you wouldn't expect to see similar kind of recovery factors of the oil in place.
Bob, on page 4 of your direct testimony, the first session, the last sentence, the movable oil was swept by a natural water flood, leaving behind the ROZs, hence the name. Bob, my question to you is that, do you have any experience, or let's say within the Permian Basin, has there been some of these fields that you talked about? Has there been any of these fields that has undergone high volume of water injection, and then you still be able to recover the ROZs?
I am not aware of any. I just not studied any.
So will this area that we are talking about will be the first one?
Yes, I'm just not aware of any. So yes, this would be the first one.
Okay, so Bob, during the direct, you talked about Kinder Morgan on your exhibit D6. We were talking about the Talcotton field, and you said that there was a failed attempt at first, but Kinder Morgan came back and then started the CO2 injection. So I want to know, do you know how long it took before Kinder Morgan was able to see oil coming out through the, let's say, from the CO2 injection?
6 months.
Did they produce substantial amount of water prior to that?
Oh, yes, yes, uh-huh.
Okay. So Bob, I'll go back to page 4, the last but one paragraph. You talk about a percentage of the oil is forced from the pores and the CO2 is trapped, becoming incidentally sequestered. Let me go to the top. You say that the process also changed the surface tension of the oil and its attraction to the rock. So you're talking about wettability there. Now, the earlier question that I asked, the EMSU, the San Andreas, has undergone significant amount of water injection. There is a possibility that the wettability might have changed and also introduce water chemistry, which is different from the one, let's say, in the San Andreas. Do you believe that the potential changes in the wettability might also impact how much residual oil we do have in place as of today?
Okay, we're changing the amount of oil that we have in place. I think you would have produced some of that oil if it was available. So I'm not sure if the change in the water chemistry has changed the wettability. I'd not thought about it. I haven't studied it, but that's off the top of my head that if that were the case, I would imagine that you would have started to produce some oil out of that interval for the water supply wells.
Then let's talk about the water supply wells that has been within the area that we are talking about. You know, significant amount of water that has been produced from the San Andreas. And like you're saying, I mean, if let's say there's a potential changes in the wettability, there is a possibility that some of these residual oil will become mobile. So do you believe that if there is some kind of oil there, at least we should have seen some production through the water wells?
Oh, I'm not sure about how much water's been produced, or, the thing is that if you're producing water and injecting it into your wells, you may very well just slap yourselves on the back and say, "Yeah, we're producing more oil." And did they ever test the water that they were their makeup water? Did they ever run it through a barrel to see if there was a slick of oil in it? I don't know if they ever produced any oil or not. I know at Yates Field back in the 1990s, the methodology that Marathon was using was to produce as much oil as they possibly could. And they were producing 50,000 barrels of water a day to try to draw down the water and make more oil. Well, they were selling that water or giving that water to Burlington Resources for use in their McCamey Field flood. And Burlington was seeing an increase in their oil production, but they also noticed that in their large volume tanks, their settling tanks basically, where they were storing the water until they were using for injection, they were seeing oil, and they were seeing 500 barrels of oil coming out of 50,000 barrels of produced water from Yates Field that Burlington at McCamey said, well, that's our oil now. So yes, there are examples of where, produced water, unless properly treated, may have enough oil in it that we don't recognize.
Bob, so is it your testimony that as of today, the bottom of the ROZ is not known in the EMSU?
That's correct. I have some inferences. Bob Lindsay says that he's seen oil in the core as deep as minus 700 feet in the St. Andreas, but that's kind of anecdotal information. We've seen those two cores, the 679 and the 4, and in there we don't see the bottom of the ROZ because the core stopped in the ROZ.
So, but as of today, you can confirm that at least there is an ROZ in the upper San Andreas.
Oh, absolutely.
But not extensively in the lower San Andreas.
Don't know.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, William.
Mr. Lamkin, questions?
Good afternoon, Dr. Trintam. I think I just have one clarifying question for you. So there's been discussion about how Mother Nature's water flood has potentially changed the wettability of the reservoir. Is that something that would only happen with volumes on the order of what Mother Nature's water flood would have produced, or could that potentially be something that's an effect of injection from SWDs?
I've never studied wettability changes as far as produced water or injected water goes, but the wettability probably has the potential to change, but I'm just really not sure. I'm just not sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Hearing Officer, forgive me. We forgot to ask Pilot if they had any questions.
Oh, we did. I'm sorry, Pilot. It was inadvertent oversight. Pilot.
No problem. No questions from Pilot.
Okay, and we did ask you, Mr. Beck?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that reminder. Mr. Padilla, then, do you have much redirect? It's 3:20. I want to take an afternoon break, but if you don't have very much, we'll just continue until you're done.
I don't think I have too much redirect, if any, but I'd like to confer with my clients.
Sure.
Was that a request for a break, Mr. Padilla?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Thank you.
I apologize. I think we were all left kind of hanging with that one. Mr. Hearing Officer, I think that was a request for a break.
Okay, well, do we excuse this witness or are we coming back for redirect?
No, we don't excuse them yet.
Okay,
Unless I'll let you know.
great. 15 minutes. All right.
So can we do a 15-minute break, Mr. Harwood?
Let's do that.
Okay. We will be back at 3:35.
We're on the record.
Okay, I see Dr. Trentham there. And are you ready to proceed, Mr. Padilla?
Mr. Harwood, we don't have any redirect.
Okay,
The witness may be released.
thank you. You anticipated my next question. Okay, Dr. Trentham, thank you. And you may not be aware of it, but you hold the record so far as the shortest witness of all.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
It's very good. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your attention.
All right, let's see. I show Steve Melzer as next on my list. Is that who you're calling?
We'll call Steve Meltzer at this time, Mr. Harwood.
Great. Is it Dr. or Mr. Melsner?
Just Mr.
All
I
right.
guess if I can figure this out. Okay, Mr.
Okay, Mr. Melzer, if you'll raise your right hand, you swear and affirm the testimony you give here today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury.
I do.
All right, thank you, sir. Mr. Padilla, Ms. Hardy, and Ms. Shaheen.
Mr. Meltzer, please state your full name.
Lawrence Stephen Melzer.
And you're a petroleum engineer?
I'm actually a geological engineer.
Okay. Can you tell the commission what a geological engineer is?
Okay. And when I'm with engineers, I'm a geologist, and when I'm with geologists, I'm an engineer. So, I try to ride the middle. It's an interesting discipline. Not many of us around. So.
And for what purpose have you been retained in this for this hearing?
They wanted to look at the ROZ, its producibility, its analogs, and the like.
Mr. Meltzer, I've seen your resume or vitae curriculum or curriculum vitae, I should say. And it's impressive. Can you give us a little bit of flavor of what your experience is with regard to ROZs?
Okay. I actually kicked off an assignment that the University of Texas Board of Regents put me in the University of Texas Permian Basin back in 1994 to create an organization that looked at CO2 flooding, the future of CO2 flooding in West Texas, as a way to kind of avoid a quicker decline of the reservoirs in West Texas. Hired a fellow from the Exxon, just retired. He was my mentor in CO2 flooding. We created several short courses together with the majors like Exxon, Mobil, Texaco, and the like. And I got to learn from all of them, their experience as they were thinking of moving from West Texas investments to offshore investments and selling the properties in West Texas, which many of them did. And they needed somebody.
Mr. Meltzer, I'm not sure if everyone hears you. You might pull that
A little closer.
a little closer.
Okay. And so we had to educate the smaller companies about CO2 flooding, and then we created a proposal in 1992, I think it was, to submit a research proposal to do work on the residual oil zones that the majors were developing and reporting in our conferences. And so we ended up creating a conference. We just conducted our 30th. We call it the CO2 flooding, and did that last December.
Does that CO2 flooding involve ROZs?
It does, and I'll show in some of my testimony where it's been done, and it's being done internationally. By the way, I made to mention that I left that post 4 years after creating it, and went to consulting a good bit on the subject of CO2 and CO2 EOR. And in that role, I've been around the world, basically at several places, evaluating whether they have ROS potential and CO2 potential in many fields around the world.
In those around the world fields that you've been to, do you find the same type of geology for ROZ?
Well, the geology is very dramatically, almost every field is a different animal to itself. And what I found over the years is that there are at least 3 types of ROZs. And we'll define that here in a minute, but you can vertically flood, Mother Nature can vertically flood a field and leave a residual oil zone below it. Or you can laterally flood it, which is the case in the Permian Basin. Or you can actually have tectonic movement that alters the oil water contact and then have that kind of a CO2 ROZ flood. And so the one that dominates everybody's attention is these laterally flooded zones that we have in West Texas.
Do you find ROZs in what you would call an aquifer?
Well, I don't like the term aquifer. I tend to think of those as being water that's used for human purposes. Very seldom would that be the case in a ROZ. It does produce only water, generally speaking, except in the upper part. But the opportunity to use that for surficial use is kind of limited because of the high salinities involved in the ROZs. So I know people use the word aquifer because it makes only water, but I think it gives a misrepresentation of the fact that it's an ROZ.
Mr. Chairman, we tender Mr. Meltzer as expert witness in geological engineering.
Mr. Rankin, any objection?
No objection based on the direct testimony that Mr. Melzer has provided on that expertise.
Thank you, Mr. Moander.
No objection from OCD.
Mr. Beck,
No objection.
Mr. Suazo.
Pilot has no objections.
He will be so recognized.
Mr. Meltzer, you prepared a self-affirmed statement with a number of exhibits on it, correct?
Yes, those are my statements.
Now, attached to your self-affirmed statement are exhibits C1 through C17, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Melzer, are the contents of your self-affirmed statement true and correct to the best of the knowledge, as well as the exhibits you attached to it?
Yes, they are.
Mr. Chairman, we offer the self-affirmed statement together with exhibits C1 through C17 into evidence.
Any objection from Goodnight?
No objection.
OCD?
No objection from OCD, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Rice?
No objection.
Pilot?
Pilot has no objections.
Self-affirmed statement and exhibits C1 through 17 will be admitted.
Mr. Meltzer, we have a series of slides to summarize your testimony. So we'll start off with the first one and tell us what is in there. What it
Okay,
depicts.
I think there was an introduced perhaps by Dr. Lindsay, but this comes from an author, 1999, Alton Brown. It's a highly idealized water and oil profile of saturations in the Seminole field. And I might add that this particular field was where the term ROZ started. And Hess was at the time realized that the shows of oil continued down well over 300 feet below their oil water contact. And so they did a pretty careful analysis, as you've heard, with core, both conventional, one or two sponge cores and one pressure core, which they have reported on at our conference in past years. And I want to note particularly this top zone is the main pay zone, much like the case in EMSU, we're in the Grayburg. And then what you see is a transition of oil and water saturations where the water saturation is increasing through an interval. It's usually about 35 to 50 feet in most fields. And then it goes into a constant oil and water saturation for some distance, and then transitions off at the bottom again to zero. And so that would be the base of the ROZ where the oil saturation gets very close to zero.
Mr. Meltzer, would you say the main pay zone here in the Seminole, is that a Grayburg zone?
The green
Yes.
here, analog would probably be a very good one for the EMSU from Seminole here.
And the residual oil zone, is that San Andres?
Well, in this case, this is all San Andres, from top to bottom, top of the main pay to the base of the oil saturation.
Okay. So effectively, the ROZ is at the bottom of the pay zone.
Actually, there's
below the main pay zone.
Yeah, the ROZ is below what I'd like to call the producing oil water contact, because the company that develops the main pay will generally want to stop before they make much water, excuse me. And that would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 to 85 to 90% oil. And then that's the producing oil water contact. The actual static oil water contact would be where you make no more oil, which is just a few feet below that.
Now, I've heard you and other technological witnesses that we have talk about the transition zone. Can you explain to me what a transition zone is? I'm sure it's the difference between the main pay zone and the residual oil zone, but you call it transition zone. What is that?
Well, it's a smearing of oil and water saturations. There's never, hardly ever a step change in that oil and water saturations, and it transitions over an interval that's 20 to 50 feet, roughly speaking. And it depends on the properties of the rock as to how thick that will be. And I might add too that the reason that ROZ technology has come about is because of fields like this, like Seminole, where most fields will have a oil zone that's only 10 to 50 feet. And the transition zone is what they saw below the producing oil water contact.
Okay.
And so they never saw a thickness like this. This is, over 100 feet of roughly constant oil saturation. So we had to come up with a different name. And Hess saw that first. Shell at Wasson Field saw it next. And that's kind of where it all started.
Mr. Meltzer, explain to the commission what that scale at the bottom on water saturation, how that plays into your.
Yeah, I think this has been covered in the previous testimony, but oil saturation and water saturation are related in that the combination of the two add up to one.
Okay.
And in situ. There's some gas saturation that can enter the picture, but we're talking about oil zones here in particular.
No, that's fine. This slide defines a residual oil zone. Explain to the commission. First of all, I want you to explain, you have a, in parentheses, POWC. What does that mean?
Producing oil water contact.
And how does that play into ROS?
Okay. You'll notice, first of all, that I don't use numbers here, except in the case of the water saturation, and that's arbitrary too, because the operator may decide he's willing to put up with 20 or 30% water. But usually it's closer to 85 or 90% where he says, I'm not going to drill any deeper. And then we call it the producing oil water contact. It's usually defined in the unitization agreement. Very, very oftentimes, or very arguably, between the owners of the field. And so that's right in the middle of the transition zone where they've cut off the producing oil water contact and defined it there. And then what happens is that in normal fields, that just varies down to zero, say a few feet, tens of feet below the producing oil water contact, and they call that a transition zone. However, where you have a deep field, deep interval of shows like they do at Seminole and San Andres formations in general, that'll be 50 feet, maybe 30 to 50 feet, that interval of transition where you get varying and declining oil saturation. Below that, it'll stay constant for a while if the zone of oil shows is thick enough. And then
Is an ROZ typically below the producing oil water contact?
in most definitions, yes. And so the main pay is above it, and then the ROZ starts below that. Some people will still define a transition zone at the top of the ROZ. I like to do that myself.
Does your definition define a greenfield
It can.
ROZ?
It can. If there is no producing oil water contact, it means there was no main pay. And so you have a transition at the top of the ROZ and a transition at the base of it.
Okay. Can move on. This is marked Exhibit C3. And what is this?
This is part of what Dr. Bob Trenum likes to call the well, get his terminology here. It's his cookbook, he calls it. And what it is things to look for if you think you might have an ROZ. And we take this concept to various folks and try to determine whether they have one. It is broad, like I think was mentioned in early testimony, and not all of these pieces of evidence will be present, and some of them will give you a false reading. But generally speaking, it's sort of like the job that lawyers and hearing examiners have. You piece a lot of information together to try to figure out what the right answer is, and that's what we use here, and make a judgment as to whether the ROZ is present or not.
Does this cookbook apply to the San Andres
Oh, yes.
ROZ underlying?
Well, the ROZs and the San Andres will have most of these attributes.
Have you applied this cookbook recipe to the San Andres underlying the MSU?
Yes, I sure did. And it passes my judgment test as being an ROZ through a thick interval. We don't have a lot of core data, as you know, and we've been talking about. So we just know that it's present for some thickness that where the core ended, but we don't know how deep it goes.
So you can't tell below the core whether there's ROZ.
Well, I'm not a skeptic of petrophysics because I use it a lot, but it's by itself, it's not enough to say that it's going to tell you where the ROZ ends. In other words, there's so many factors, as you've heard, that play into that, M&N and water saturation. And the water saturation can vary on these laterally swept Mother Nature water floods. So it's a very good diagnostic, but not a perfect one. So yeah, I don't know where the bottom is, frankly.
In terms of the depths above the core in the 679 well and our bell number 4 well, do these factors play a prominent role in deciding whether or not there's a ROS?
They do play a factor, yes.
And what was your conclusion?
That enough of them were present that it's, I guess I'm trying to pick my right word, conclusively, Roz?
In the San Andres?
Yes.
Okay. Let's go to the next.
Well, I was also asked to show where ROSs are present. And this is just the Permian Basin examples. We've got a number of them around the world. And what happened as a result of the recognition of the residual oil zones in general is that companies started to say, wait a minute, I need to be flooding, CO2 flooding below the producing oil water contact. And so most of them, at least all of them here, that saw that those shows below the producing oil water contact said, I guess I can deepen the wells and inject into the ROZ, the upper ROZ in many cases. And so there's, as you see, there's 24 that we've identified. It's very hard to find the literature to back this up, but I feel very confident that that's exactly what they knew what they were doing. And sometimes they commingled them with the main pay because they were already flooding the main pay zone above. And most of them were that way. And then you see the 5 and 6 line there, that the tall cotton phase. We talked about that earlier. And what that is, once we determined, as the next slide will show, the fairways of sweep, of Mother Nature's sweep of the oil, this is a green field. And we define a green field as a flood, an area of oil shows that doesn't have a main pay. In other words, when many of them drilled into the ROZ and were frustrated that they got very little oil show at all and made only water. And as you get deeper into the ROZ, it's really rare that you see any oil show or not, you know, in the produced fluids. So we'll talk a little bit about the Cotton Project in a minute. And that is what we call a greenfield ROZ, whereas the others are brownfield ROZs.
Mr. Meltzer, I noticed that they're numbers 7, 8, 9, 10, and 12 are in Lee County, New Mexico.
Yes, yes, they are.
Are they in the area for the AMSU is?
Yeah, they're not far. Probably the closest one is Hobbs, if I remember my geography right. And thing to note on some of those, maybe all of them, is that they have commingled the ROZ and the main pay zone. In other words, that they decided from the get-go they would produce them both simultaneously, not just try to separate the main pay from the ROZ. And that's become a trend of late that folks, they know they're going to make oil with CO2 or an EOR process in general, enhanced oil recovery process. And so they will design the project to include part of the ROZ, if not all of it.
And the ROS is, well, explain to us how all of these, except the bottom, are San Andres production, right?
I think all but one. There's a flood in the Horseshoe Atoll area. We'll see what number that is. It's got to be in here. Let's see. Anyway, it's a Pennsylvanian. There it is, Salt Creek. And that's over in the eastern part of the Permian Basin. And they had a ROZ underneath that Pennsylvanian reef.
And that's the one that's producing out of the Canyon Reef, is that?
It is. Yes,
Okay. Let's go on to this exhibit C5, this slide. What does that tell us?
Okay, I updated this in early January of last year, and These are published numbers on the original oil in place and the main pay. Many of them have, the ROZ floods have added oil in place numbers for the ROZ. But what I thought I'd do was demonstrate some recoveries that they've had. And some of this analysis is difficult, but I've had some help from Hess, especially who owns Seminole, on doing this. And you can see these are large fields in general because the capital expenses are pretty high on putting in a CO2 flood. And then the primary recovery in Seminole was only about 11% of the main pay. And they decided to go to water flood pretty quickly. And we attribute 338 million barrels to the water flood recovery there. So we're up to, 30% from the water flood. So we're up to about 41%. And that was all main pay zone. So we produced 41% of the oil in place in the primary and secondary recovery phase. Then they decided to go into CO2 recovery. And you can see how successful they were there, that they got 28%. That's a really good number. It's actually up to 30 now in the recovery from the enhanced oil recovery, the main pay zone. And they added the ROZ later in the life of that. So part of that recovery from CO2 is now in the ROZ, from the ROZ. And you can see that's 68 million barrels, so not insignificant. I've got a graph of this later. And then the total recovery to date is 70% of the original oil in place. So it's a big number. And that's impressive. Credit to Hess, and which is now owned by Oxy, I might add, the field is.
So essentially out of the ROS, as I understand this compilation, is that it's 68 million additional barrels of oil.
Yeah, just from below the producing oil water contact.
Now you show us the next slide, Exhibit C7.
Yes, this is the Denver unit. This is part of the Wasson field that you've heard about already. And you can see the main pay zone oil in place there is about twice what it was at Seminole. They've recovered about 38% of the oil in place from the main pay to date. That would include primary, secondary, and CO2. And so the recovery of CO2 by itself is 351. Let me back up. 851 is not including the CO2. The 351 adds the CO2 in. So they're up to, you can see, over 50%. And they also instituted in, I guess, later, about 2005 or 6, they started flooding the ROS portion with CO2. And it's a little different, more difficult analysis to figure out what's coming from them, from the ROS, but it's got to be greater than 50 million barrels. I just used a conservative number there. So their total recovery to date is about 54% of the total oil in place, original oil in place.
So Mr. Meltzer, how does an operator go about looking for ROS and developing ROS as they did in the Denver unit? I mean, what type of strategy or exploration technique do they use to find the ROS?
Well, in the case of Seminole, let me answer that one. It's a real easy answer because what they did is they were drilling deeper to look at the Clear Fork formation. And what tipped them off was, we're getting shows through the whole interval. And so in 1985, they said, oh, we better deepen our unit. And so they petitioned the Railroad Commission and the mineral interest owners to deepen their unit from the producing oil water contact down through the St. Andrews. And fortunately, they did that because now they could flood the entire RZ. So same thing sort of went on at Wasson with the different operators in the different units there. And they saw going through the Clear Fork again that they had very thick zones of oil saturation. And I think fortunately there they had decided to unitize down through the the entire section of the San Andreas. And so they instituted CO2 flooding into the RAWs. I think early on they called it transition zone. So it only went 150 feet into the RAWs there. And you can see what they recovered at the Denver unit. Since that time, the three of the other units in the Wasson Field have done the same thing. So there's probably well over 150 million barrels that have been produced from the RAWs in the Wasson Field to date.
So the Denver unit is an actual unit, correct?
Inside the Wasson Field, yes.
And it covers all of the San Andreas.
Yeah, the unit goes down to the base of the San Andreas, as far as I know. I don't know if that's true for Tall Cotton. I mean, for Bennett Ranch and the other units there. But Shell did try to get the full unit to the bottom of the San Andreas.
Can move on. What does Exhibit CH show?
Yeah, apologize for the complexity of this graph, but it says a lot of things. Number one is at the Denver unit production, again in the Wasson Field, shows the production from January of 70, where the Railroad Commission, well, the digital data started. And you can see the peak of the water flood there in the 70s, and then the decline. And the water flood was starting to mature out. And if you project that water flood decline down to zero or near zero, you'd see that the field would have been abandoned in January 12 or 14, 2014, as that shows. And so they decided that they wanted to continue that field to recover more oil, of course. And so extending in the red is the contribution now from the CO2 flood. You can see it almost flattened, the production declined out to zero for a while, and then it started to decline again. And they said, oh, let's go after the RAWs. And you can see the first bump on that was 97. That's when they instituted their first phase of the RAWs development, and then did another addition, and they continued to do additions, very small areas inside the Denver unit. And what I tried to do was look at the difference between the decline from the main pay zone RAWs, it starts about 95, and the total production to give you that purple or blue curve. What color is it? Purple, I guess, the bottom one anyway. And you can see that the RAWs is contributing something just around 9,000 to 10,000 barrels a day from the right scale there. And so it continues to hold the production pretty flat at the Denver unit. And
Mr. Meltzer, you pointed out a very interesting thing here on this graph when we were going over it. And in the purple line towards the right of the graph, there's a sharp decline there. Can you explain what that is?
oh, out there in 2020,
Yes.
I think we'll all remember that year. That was COVID and the price drop associated with that. And, they ceased injection and production, I think, for a few months right there.
Anything further on this slide?
Oh, I think you see a little bump up there in 23. And I think they're adding some more zones. I haven't confirmed that with Occidental. That's the operator, but I'm pretty sure they're adding more zones to keep the production pretty flat.
Okay. We've seen this thing before in different form, but tell us what you have here.
Well, this came about in 2002, I think it was, when I was reviewing a lot of New Mexico literature. I think some by the New Mexico Tech folks and mining organization there in Socorro. And I noticed that the oil fields in the San Andres were aligning in certain pattern, and not knowing enough about the history, the paleogeography of the Permian Basin. I said, well, these things are lining up nicely. And it turns out that we call them fairways, where Dr. Bob Lindsay talked about this, where there was an uplift in New Mexico associated with the Laramide, and then basin and range tectonic events. And the water, the San Andres is outcropped. If you drive from, let's say, Roswell to Plains and aren't asleep, you see these sinkholes off to the left about halfway up, and that's where that water comes in. And at least in one of the fairways there, the Roswell fairway and then the Slaughter fairway. And so it went through the uplifted sections of the San Andres, and what we define as the fields that are indicated in the various colors there, San Andres blue, is swept out about half of the oil that was entrapped prior to those uplifts. And so we would decide then that there's sweep going on in all the San Andres zones there. And we decided, well, gee, there's areas that didn't have a bump on top of the RZ on field, and that's what we looked for 70 years in the Permian Basin, with those bumps on top of the RZ. And so we defined those as green fields where there was no primary production, brown fields where, you know, the production was there and they deepened into the ROZ. So I've named off a few fields, and I should point out that EMSU and the whole complex there in Monument Field area is in that Artesia fairway.
What does Exhibit C10 show?
Okay, this is the tall cotton, the example of the green field. And I like to show this because there were people coming out of the woodwork saying, what are you doing out there? Because there's no primary production. And Kinder Morgan said, well, we believe in greenfield ROZs. And so they drilled the wells. You can see there's 40 wells in a less than a section area, by the way. This is about 580 acres now. It's a little less than that before the phase 2 program. And so it took them a few months to see any oil, because you started to have the CO2 interact with the oil that was residual oil. And sure enough, it did. And then they got pretty excited, as you can see there in mid second decade of 2000s, and added more wells and infield drilled mostly, but added a few wells on the periphery to create a peak of production of about 3,000 barrels per day. And we added this little insert here because it's made now over 5 million barrels of oil.
And that's a green field.
It was a greenfield ROS in a less than a section of land.
Would that be pretty easy to overlook if you didn't study it further?
You can say it was overlooked for 70 or 80 years.
Let's go on to the next. You show oil saturation in this exhibit C11, C12, and then you have a C13, which shows the map.
Yeah.
Tell us about the RR Belcourt and what you saw there.
Well, interestingly enough, you have a main pay zone in the Grayburg there in the left one, RR Belcourt. And you notice that at the base of the Grayburg and the top of the San Andres, you can see pretty much similar in terms of oil saturations. And these are from conventional core again. So they're running about 15, say on average, say 15% oil saturations. And I completely agree with what the doctors Lindsay and Trenum have said about conventional core being the lowest possible value for the in situ core saturation, the in situ saturation. And so We commonly will double that. That's a little less than what Dr. Lindsay was talking about, but very typically in the St. Andrews Formation, typical lithologies in the St. Andrews Formation, something like a double of the conventional core saturation will be representative of what it is in situ. So Seminole helped us with those numbers with their pressure core. So anyway, that's the interpretation I put on the data you've seen already. And that's clearly a definition of a ROS in my mind. And then over in the middle, does Exhibit C12, you see the EMSU. And I think these numbers are very consistent with the scatter you always see in the lithologies within the St. Andrews and even worse in the Grayburg. I think it's hard, in my mind, it's hard to argue that we don't have some ROZ down to sea level minus 700. That's my interpretation. And the base of the oil saturation, if you go by the interpretations on the logs, would look like maybe 4,300 feet. So that if I had to guess where the base was, I'd say it's minus 700 from this graph. We need more data, but that's at least from the data we have. And then you all are familiar with the graph on the right. Right? You know,
What's this?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
16.
I want to take a minute to say that the world has changed in the oil and gas business. We are, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say that horizontals are dominating our world. And that's because they contact more reservoir. And so one of the beauties of this area in the Monument area is that you have fractures. And a lot of those fields over in West Texas don't have the fracture network that you've got because of the intense folding that went on in the Monument area. And so what I did with a little help from the folks at Empire was look at a new flooding technique. And it turns out that a company in Texas is doing exactly this. And they're flooding from bottom to top. And you can do this with horizontals in the bottom, try to contact as much of that oil in the near the base of the ROS and allow the buoyancy of CO2 to float that oil up, basically interact with the oil and create a front. The problem typically has been these baffles. And we've talked a little bit about baffles already. But the beauty is we've got these fractures because of the intense folding. And I do very strongly believe we'll be able to vertically flood all the way up, maybe even into the Grayburg. We're going to have to repressure the Grayburg here because you need miscibility. And that term means that the oil and CO2 mix and create a new material that is more mobile than the very typically lower gravity ROS oil. But we've proven that that works in the other fields that we've CO2 flooding. And this would be a wonderful new concept, which is going to take some capital to do, of course. And I think we'll be able to watch the folks over in Texas when they raise their money to do their project. So that'll be an analog for us there. So,
Mr. Meltzer, just so to understand this exhibit, you have an injector on the right and it's a horizontal and it disperses CO2 and it floats up to the top and you have a producing well at the top.
Correct. It could be done with verticals too in the main pay.
Okay.
Which would save a lot of money perhaps. But,
right.
Both concepts are real in my mind.
Let's move on.
I think we're
This
at the
is
end.
the last exhibit. You have C17. What do you try to tell us here?
In the study we did back in the 2008 to 15 timeframe, this was research work that we did with the REPSI Research Partnership Secure Energy for America. And we were working with UTPB, and Bob Trenum and I were kind of the leaders on that project. We asked a company called ARI, Advanced Resources International, to help us with assessing what the total oil in place numbers might be in the RAS in the green fields only. These are areas that didn't have fields over the top, those areas that were empty, if you will, in the fairways. And they looked at 6 counties. or 5 counties. I wish we'd done Lee County. I think they may have done that since this time. But you can see the total areas of acreage and total oil in place numbers they came up with. I'll highlight the 5th column over there, which is 150 million barrels, 150 billion barrels, excuse me, of oil in place in the green fields in those 5 counties. And they divided into higher quality and lower quality. That would be based upon the facies, not so much on the oil saturation, but on the facies of the rock. And you can see even with the small 15% oil recovery factor, 16 billion barrels of producible oil in those 5 counties in the ROZ. And at the time, REPSI was very interested in how much CO2 you would store with a typical utilization rate of 16 MCF per barrel of oil. I won't go into that. It's another whole subject to itself, but there's a lot of CO2 you'll store when you're making that oil.
So when you're talking about 15% oil recovery factor, is that a conservative figure that you inserted here?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
The 15% oil recovery factor, which is the column second from the right. How did you arrive at 15%?
Well, I wanted to be ultra conservative because that is a typical number we get from a main pay that's been water flooded. And so we'll get 15% of the original oil in place. But when it's been naturally water flooded, we've already lost the water flood barrels. So the oil in place number is going to be a different number than the original oil in place, because now we're at apples and oranges. Like, this is really complicated and I'm going to lose everybody. But 15%, if it was a main pay zone, is a very conservative number. We think we'll double that with an ROZ recovery factor because of the fact that it's been water flooded. So,
okay. That's in the, but these are greenfield ROZs that you're.
Correct. Only the green fields.
Okay.
Yes.
What conclusions do you draw from all of your exhibits that we've?
Well, first of all, I was tasked to say whether it's an ROZ in St. Andrews and the EMSU clearly is in my mind. And then is it amenable to water or CO2 flooding? And I think it is. And I think that it may even allow, because of those vertical fractures, it may even allow a more novel approach to get even more oil than you would expect from, say, this table. And so what I would think is that more data is required. I mean, unfortunately, that's the world we live in. We never have enough data, but we need it. But I think all the signals are pointing to a successful RZ project in the St. Andrews in EMSU.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Harwood, pass the witness for cross.
Thank you, Mr. Rankin.
Thanks, Mr. Hearing Officer. I do have cross. Good afternoon, Mr. Melzer. How are you today?
Okay.
Good. I understand you were retained by Empire to provide an overview of residual oil zones in the Permian Basin. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And based on your experience having worked with them over the years in the Permian Basin?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But now, when you, as part of your direct testimony that you filed back in August of 2024, do you recall that you were requested to provide all the documents that you had referenced or relied on in preparing your analysis and coming to your conclusions?
The ones requested, yes.
Is your understanding that the pre-hearing order required all experts to provide all the documents that they referenced or relied on in coming to their conclusions?
I think I did that, and much of it was in a form, a website data. Yes, sir.
Right. So I'm going to just bring to the, on my, once I get onto the sharing page here. When we received your or your testimony back in August 2024, Empire's counsel provided us with a document that identified for each expert who provided direct testimony, the documents that those experts reviewed or relied on. This is part of the record, so I'm not going to admit it as an exhibit, but I will just scroll down here just so to the entries where you have identified the where it's identifies where you have provided two documents that you had referenced or relied on in support of your testimony. Do you now you don't, obviously those numbers don't mean anything to you, so I'm going to pull them up so you can see them. Okay.
Sure.
But there are two documents, and the first one is 30 years of ROZ studies and dated February 2023. It's a 6-page document that is a sort of overview of different types of CO2 EOR projects and ROZ projects. Do you recognize this document?
Yes, sir, I do.
Is that one of the documents you provided?
Yes.
Okay. And then the second document is this final report. You may have actually even been referring to it in your testimony, but it's a 231-page report that addresses an overview or case studies of ROZ CO2 flood in and around the Permian. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. But neither of those two reports address the EMSU unit, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So as to the EMSU unit, although I think I see it in your testimony, you did review two cores specific to the EMSU, correct?
Core reports.
Core reports.
Yes,
And that was the 679 and the RR Bell number 4, correct?
that's correct.
Is there any other data or information specific to the EMSU that you reviewed in preparation for your direct testimony that you submitted in August?
24.
Mm-hmm.
August 24. I have to think about that, but I'm sure I read some testimony that was presented. Yes, but that would have been afterwards. So no.
No. Okay. So at the time you prepared your testimony in August 2024, only data specific to the EMSU were those two core reports, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you were not asked to evaluate whether the purported RZ in the San Andreas or even the Grayburg is recoverable in this case.
And I was asked to look at the ROZ as the potential for CO2 flooding. Yes.
Okay, let me ask the question again. Were you asked to evaluate specifically whether the purported RZ in the Grayburg or San Andreas is technically recoverable?
Not exactly. No, not explicitly.
Okay, let me ask, I think it's a yes or no question. Were you asked to opine on whether the ROZ in either the Grayburg or San Andreas is technically recoverable?
I'm thinking about the conversations.
Is it in your direct testimony?
And that's not in my direct testimony.
Okay. And you wouldn't be able to do that by just looking at two core reports, would you?
It would be difficult to do. Yes, sir.
Okay. And along those same lines, you wouldn't be able to determine based on the two core reports what the recovery factors might be in the EMSU.
That's correct.
And you wouldn't be able to determine based on those core reports or anything else you reviewed with respect to the EMSU, whether the ROZ, reported ROZ in the San Andreas or Grayburg is economically recoverable, would you?
No, sir.
So you're not offering any opinions on whether the purported ROZ in the San Andreas or Grayburg is economically recoverable, are you?
Only by analog with the two fields.
Have you established any basis to that those fields are analogous?
In some ways, yes, sir.
Okay, what data have you reviewed to confirm that, and where is it in your testimony?
It is the oil saturations from the core.
Okay. Now, have you looked at the API, the gravity, the viscosity, any other elements or components of the oil that was in the San Andreas in the EMSU?
No, because you can't sample residual oil.
Don't you have okay, so you can't have, so you're telling me that it's not possible to, is it not possible to determine whether ROZ is economically recoverable from the San Andreas at this point?
Only by analog.
Okay, so your contention is that just based on the oil saturations in the core, that you can draw a comparison and confirm that, or make an opinion that the EMSU ROZ, purported ROZ, is analogous to all the other ROZs that you discussed today in your testimony?
Say that again.
So
Sure,
is your opinion that just by looking at the oil saturations in those two core reports for the EMSU, that you can opine that the EMSU is analogous to every other field in ROZ development that you discussed in your testimony today?
Well, not every field, but an analog to the Seminole is pretty good.
Okay, just based on the oil saturations?
Yeah, in the saturation levels, yes.
Okay, so that's the sole basis for your opinion that they're analogous?
Proximity and rock types also.
Okay, now are you aware of any, you gave us a lot of different examples of ROZ plays. Are you aware of any commercial or pilot ROZ developments on the west side of the Central Basin Platform and south of the San Simon Channel?
I'm not.
Okay.
Well, you mind if I caveat that?
Sure.
I think the commingled north and south Hobbs fields do include the ROZ.
Are they south of the San Simon Channel?
I'm thinking geography here. It's really close there. I think they are north of the San Simon.
Okay. You're familiar with the tilt, is the oil water contact tilt study that Mr. Brown did, that Dr. Trentham referenced in his testimony?
Yes.
Now, I can bring it up if you'd like, but are you, as I understand, that study documented oil water contact tilts, which is an indication of a Mother Nature's water flood event occurring?
That's correct.
Now, I didn't see any oil water contact tilts indicating that anything in the EMSU. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Were you aware at the time you prepared your August 2024 testimony that there were 6 water supply wells in the EMSU that were completed in the San Andreas in the EMSU?
No, I was not.
Okay. And were you aware of the approximately 20 additional water supply wells that have been and were withdrawing water from the San Andreas in the area immediately offsetting the EMSU?
The water supply wells?
Yeah.
No, sir.
Okay. The time you prepared testimony in August 2024, were you aware that there was produced water disposal occurring in the San Andreas and the EMSU since the 1960s?
I was not. I might have expected that there be.
Yeah. They have to put the water somewhere, right? Were you aware at the time you provided your testimony that Empire was also disposing of produced water into the same San Andres zone within the EMSU?
Yes.
You were aware of that?
Repeat it, better repeat it.
Sure.
Yes,
Were you
understood.
aware at the time of your testimony in August 2024 that Empire was also disposing of produced water into the same San Andres zone within the EMSU?
No, I was not.
Okay.
Sorry.
Now, I think I'm anticipating your answer, but just to be clear, because ROZs have low oil saturation and high water saturations, when you try to produce them, they generally will produce high volumes of water by definition, correct?
By definition,
Yeah. And that's the experience at Tall Cotton, correct?
that is correct.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. Now I think we kind of addressed this already, so I'm not going to ask that one. Are you aware, Mr. Melzer, of any commercial or pilot ROZs currently under development or that have been producing that are thicker than 400 feet?
Almost of the same mindset that Bob Trenum is. Anecdotally, I can say that, but I can't prove it.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay. So you're not, as you sit here, aware of any that are thicker than that today?
No, that's a fair statement.
Okay. You referenced in one of your exhibits the Seminole San Andres unit, the SSAU. That particular unit, as I think I understood from your testimony, that it was developed in conjunction with a main pay zone. Is that right? Or subsequent to a main pay zone?
Yes, it was. All the extensions were into the ROZ from existing wells. And then they drilled some dedicated injection wells. But that's it.
Okay. And in the Denver unit that you referenced, is that also the case that they developed that ROZ either in conjunction with or subsequent to the development of the main pay zone?
Correct.
Yeah. On the Tall Cotton, were you involved in that project?
It depends on the definition there. They called me down to talk about ROZs, and it wasn't too long after that they started buying leases. So I guess you could call me involved, but I wasn't buying any leases.
No. Okay. Let me ask this. Were you consulting at the time for the company at the time they were developing that project?
Actually, it was more of a trade. They support our CO2 conference really well. If they asked me to do something, I usually did it.
Okay.
So I went down and briefed them.
Okay. So in other words, were you there with them from the inception of that project?
I was watching it from the inception. I with them is probably too specific. I didn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
So did you consult with them at the time they were initiating that project?
Pretty close to the time they initiated it.
Okay.
A little bit before that.
What did you do when you consulted with them on the project? And I guess just to be clear, I guess, was it who was the initiator of the project, the operator?
It was Kinder Morgan.
Kinder Morgan. Okay. Did you consult with Kinder Morgan on how to develop this ROZ?
They asked for my advice. I don't think they took it all.
Got it. Now, that case, did you participate with Kinder Morgan or assist with them in any way? Or when you said what was your role when I think they went to hearing before the Texas Railroad Commission, correct?
They went to
a hearing before the
hearing?
Texas
Yep,
Railroad Commission. Were you involved with that hearing at all?
I did not participate.
Okay. So in your, have you been, so you say you tracked that project, or you've been watching, have you tracked it from inception to the current?
Correct.
You have. And you've been tracking the production from that project?
Yes, sir.
And you're aware that Kinder Morgan has divested it?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to talk a little bit more about that project since you have some familiarity with it. You allude to it and you give us some background, very limited background on it, but you don't go into any detail, correct?
Correct.
On the Tall Cotton project, Dr. Trentham did give us a little bit of, let me find where that is, 1 second. I guess, let me just ask this question. The Tall Cotton project, it was a 1-section project, right?
Correct.
That was it. That was it, just 1 section, right?
Well, they had leased a whole 9 sections and developed the one on the east.
So the first phase, it was a 2-phase project, I think I gather from your slides, right? It was a 2-phase project.
Correct.
But both phases were entirely within the 1 section, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Do you recall what the well spacing was for the first phase?
I think it was 80.
80 acre
I think
spacing?
it was 80 acres.
Are you confident of that?
60 to 80, for sure. Broad, and then the infill was tighter because those infill wells.
Now, this is a greenfield though, correct? The Tall Cotton?
Yeah, yes, sir.
So there wouldn't be, so the initial well spacing, is that the pattern, 80 acre pattern, you mean?
That's correct.
Okay. So how many wells in a pattern?
I think there were 16 in that original.
16 total in the,
Doesn't fit, does it?
in the, I think you're almost right. I think, would it surprise if it were 20 producers?
I think there was 18, if I
Okay.
remember correctly.
Okay.
So it may have been less than 80, 60
Okay.
acres.
Now, but you've been tracking that project from the inception. Are you familiar with how that project has produced over time?
I am.
Yeah. And did you hear Dr. Trentham's description of it as an excellent RZ project?
Made a lot of oil, yes, sir. Economically, I won't quote, unless you ask me, I'll not comment.
Are you aware? I mean, do you have information on the economics? You can answer that as yes or no. Do you have information on the economics?
No,
You
not
don't?
from them.
Not from them. Where did you have information on the economics? Where did you get that information from?
Back of the envelope. I know what a well costs. I know about what it takes to operate those vertical wells. My weakness is on the costs, on the front end costs.
Okay. So if someone wanted to, they could go to the Texas Railroad Commission and they could look up and see what the costs were proposed by what Kinder Morgan thought the cost would be to undertake that first phase of that project.
I don't think that data is available.
Okay. So you're unfamiliar with what the cost is, the actual cost that was incurred by Kinder Morgan to undertake that project?
Well, I think that's the same question. I think the weakness I have is in the capital cost.
Okay. Do you know how many injecting wells that phase 1 project employed?
I think there were 28 and almost as many as the producing wells. So 18 plus or minus 4.
Do you know whether they employed a water curtain to help contain the CO2
Yeah,
injection?
That was why I was hesitating. They do have a water curtain, so there were more injectors and there were water and CO2 injectors.
Mm-hmm. Were they using the water produced from the RZ to manage the water curtain? Do you know?
Can only speculate.
Okay, so you're not sure how they managed the produced water from the RZ development?
I know they had a deep injection well. So
It was not the same zone. It was a deep injection well. You understand it was not the same zone as the RZ.
yes,
Okay. Was the Tall Cotton operated as a continuous CO2 injection or a water alternating gas injection?
initially it was constant, and then they did a WAG afterwards.
Do you know why they switched?
It's typical. We call them tapered floods nowadays. We try to go as long as we can to the point where we're making too much CO2, and then we start to wag. And usually in the wag cycles, the water cycles go longer over time.
Okay. Are you aware what the volumes of water production were from that ROZ?
Reported numbers weren't accurate. They typically aren't, and sometimes not even reported in the Railroad Commission.
Okay, so are you saying that because you believe that the reported volumes are not accurate, you don't know what the actual production volumes were?
I can only estimate them.
Okay.
We've been a high water cut.
What's your estimate of the water production volumes?
Oh, probably 7 or 8 times the oil volumes.
Okay.
And it varies over time.
Let's see. My eyesight is going these days. I can't see anything anymore. Sorry, 1 second. Do you know what the phase one was a smaller pattern within the one section pilot project area. What was the phase two portion of the project?
I think the acreage involved in the CO2 was 480 acres initially and 540 after phase two.
So it increased approximately 60 acres to phase two. Is that your understanding?
I think
something along those lines. Okay.
Yes.
Well, and was the phase two a different orientations or different collections of patterns?
Infill drilling, basically.
Okay.
Trying to decrease the time from injection to producing wells, transit time of the CO2.
Did they downspace to do that?
They did.
Do you know what the downspacing was?
I think it was to 40 acres.
Per pattern?
Yes.
Okay. So was it, what were the patterns they were using?
Well, modified line drive, you can call that 5-spot too if you're clever about it.
So 5 wells per pattern, and your recollection is they started at 80 acres. So how many? What's the per well spacing on that to start on phase one?
Well, I haven't done my geometry that detailed, but they went from 60 or 80 acres initially to 40 acres in the infill drilling program.
So almost down to 10 acres spacing
Between injector producer.
Yeah.
Yes.
So something on the order of between 15 and 20 acre spacing per producer injector down to 10, 15 acre per producer injector.
That sounds about right. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think that spacing is appropriate for a greenfield ROZ?
No,
so,
I don't.
You think it's in what way?
I think what they did was they could have stayed with their larger spacing and just been more patient.
Okay. But you think the original spacing at 15 to 20 acres per injector producers was appropriate for that RZ?
I do.
Okay. I guess I'll just go ahead and share this other exhibit. I wanted to, I'll put this into the record. Kinder Morgan, I'm going to ask this to be marked as, Goodnight Cross Exhibit number 5. It's the press release that was issued by Kinder Morgan back on July 17th, 2024. I pulled this down from the website. It's got a lot of material that's extraneous. It is complete. But I was just going to scroll down, Mr. Melzer, and point you to the language where Kinder Morgan in this press release addresses the status of their CO2 projects. And they indicate that, or they state that during the quarter that they're reporting on, Kinder Morgan CO2 optimized its asset portfolio through 2 transactions in the Permian Basin for a net outlay of approximately $40 million. The segment divested its interest in the Katz unit, the Goldsmith, Landreth, San Andres unit, Tall Cotton field, and Reineke unit, along with certain shallow interests in the Diamond M field, and acquired Avad Energy Partners interest in the North McElroy unit, and a leasehold interest in an undeveloped leasehold directly adjacent to Sackrock. Goes on to say, the last portion I've highlighted here, that the impact of these 2 transactions is to replace fields with high production decline rates and limited CO2 flood opportunities with fields that have attractive potential CO2 flood projects. Had you seen this press release before, Mr. Melzer?
I did skim it, yes.
Okay. So your understanding is, based on that press release, that Kinder Morgan was divesting the Tall Cotton field because it was subject to or going through a high decline rate with limited CO2.
That's what it says.
Objection. This is speculation.
I'm asking what his understanding is. He was involved with the project. I was just asking what his understanding is.
The question was pure speculative, asking
Well,
for
we haven't
speculation.
heard the answer. No, I'll allow it. It's overruled.
You can answer the question, yeah.
Yeah, let's repeat it so I get it right.
Well, I'm asking you, I guess, I don't know, we have the court report. I don't want to mess up my question again since it was overruled. I don't know if we can have it read back, because I think I was trying to ask you if your understanding was that what your understanding was based on this press release, why Kinder Morgan divested its asset at Tall Cotton.
It's a complicated answer. My feeling is they had something in mind to invest in, and it looked better than these.
Okay, fair enough. May I move the admission of this exhibit into the record?
Any objection from Empire?
Yes, I'm going to object to it. It's hearsay. We don't know where this whether this information on a press release is accurate or not. It's not from a government source or anything. It's from Kinder Morgan, and it tells us nothing in terms of the issues involved in this case. Now, if Mr. Rankin is trying to show profitability or market analysis or market value, I don't know. That's not an issue here.
Mr. Rankin, what's the purpose for this?
Well,
beyond what you've already elicited from the witness.
Yeah.
Why does it advance the commission's decision-making in this case, other than what you've elicited?
I think that based on what I've elicited, I don't need the admission of the evidence, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Okay, so you're withdrawing it as
I'll withdraw it as an exhibit.
All right, great. Solves one problem. Before you go on, Mr. Rankin, I note that it's 4:56 p.m. So give us a forecast of about how much more you have. Not to pressure you, but at some point soon we need to make a decision about adjourning for the day and continuing this. So,
Mr. Melzer, were you planning to travel tomorrow?
I'm here through the day tomorrow.
Okay. I don't want to rush myself. I didn't interrupt Mr. Padilla's hour-long summary of Mr. Melzer's testimony. I probably have, I don't know, 20 to 30 minutes of additional cross. So I could pick it up in the morning at the most.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission? Does that sound like a good plan?
Sounds like a good stopping point, yes.
All right, good. Mr. Ruma, did you have, I thought maybe you had something you wanted to cover before we adjourn for the day?
Thank you, Mr. Harwood. No, I did send an email to council for all the parties. So I'm covered.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you all, and
Can I raise a housekeeping question? And I haven't had a chance to confer with council on it, but one question I have is whether or not we can have any indication of when we might reconvene for this hearing. I don't know if the commission has been able to confer amongst themselves or have any dates or that they may offer or date ranges that we may be thinking about ourselves. So even if it's a range, so that our experts who have lots of different projects and ourselves as well can think about what may be on the horizon.
We've been so absorbed in the case. We have not talked.
Okay.
So
Understood.
we'll get you something tomorrow.
Okay, understood.
okay, thank you all. To thank all of today's witnesses, and last but certainly not least, thank you, Madam Court Reporter, for all your help today. We'll be off the record in this matter. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning promptly at 9.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. Appreciate it.